The woman on the other end of the line was apologetic in the way that people are when they're reading from a script. Polite, efficient, entirely unhelpful. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The booking was canceled at 11:47 this morning. There's nothing I can do from now on." I stood in the middle of Terminal C, one hand pressing the phone to my ear, the other gripping the handle of my carry-on. Around me, the airport moved the way airports do, purposeful, anonymous, indifferent. A family was arguing over a luggage cart. A man in a gray suit was asleep against a pillar. A child pressed both palms against the window, watching a plane push back from its gate. I looked down at my phone. My father's obituary was still open in another tab. I had been reading it on the train to the airport. The photo they used was from 20 years ago, before the years had softened him into something quieter. He looked young and slightly unsure of the camera. I had always liked that photo. "Ma'am, are you still there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here." Here's what I remember most clearly about that moment. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I felt something closer to the calm that arrives when a thing you have half expected finally shows up. Like recognizing a weather pattern you've been watching build for months. The ticket was gone. My father's funeral was in 14 hours, in a city 4 states away. And somewhere on the other side of the city I had just left, my husband was at his desk, probably answering emails, probably not thinking about me at all. I thanked the airline representative. I always thank people, even in moments when I probably shouldn't. That morning, he had kissed my forehead at the door. He had taken my bag from my hand and set it down in the hallway, the way a person does when they want to seem helpful. He had said, "Travel safe." He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile I had come to know very well, the one that appeared when he had already decided something and was simply waiting for me to catch up. I had not caught up. Not then. Standing in Terminal C, with the sound of the airport folding around me, I thought about that smile. I thought about how long I had taken it at face value. How many times I had looked at the surface of something and chosen, deliberately, not to ask what was underneath. My flight had been booked 3 weeks ago. I had confirmed it myself. The ticket was in my name, on our shared rewards account, the one we both had access to. The one with a login I had never once thought to change. There was only one person who could have done this. I put my phone in my pocket. I picked up my bag. I did not call him back. People always want a villain. A single moment of cruelty, clean and obvious to point at. That is not what this was. This was 18 months of ordinary Tuesday mornings. A grocery run I did alone, because he had a seminar. A vacation we postponed, then postponed again, then quietly stopped discussing altogether. A savings account I watched deplete itself by small, steady degrees while he finished the degree that was going to change everything for us. I want to be precise about something. I was not resentful. I made those choices with my eyes open. He was intelligent and driven, and I believed in what he was building. I worked extended hours at a job that was not what I had originally planned for myself, so that he could study without the constant weight of financial pressure. I told myself that was what partnership meant, that you took turns carrying the heavier thing. What I did not account for was that he would never ask whose turn it was. When his mother had her cardiac event, moderate, the doctors called it, as though there were a reassuring version of that word, he flew home for 5 days and came back to finish his thesis. I drove to the hospital 3 times a week for 6 weeks. I sat with her. I learned which nurses were kind and which were merely efficient. I organized her discharge paperwork, coordinated with her insurance, brought her home, and made soup from a recipe she had written on a note card 40 years ago, in handwriting that looked like his. He thanked me exactly once. Genuinely, I think. When the job offer arrived, real news, the kind we had both been waiting for, it required relocation. I requested a transfer at my company. They offered a lateral move to a smaller team in the new city. I took it. We moved in 11 days. I packed most of the boxes myself because he was already traveling for orientation. I tell you all of this not because I want credit, I tell you because I need you to understand what kind of person I was inside this marriage. Careful, present, willing. Someone who had organized her entire interior life around the quiet assumption that consistent effort was its own form of love. My father and I had not spoken for 6 years. The estrangement was complicated in the way all estrangements are. Nobody entirely right, nobody entirely wrong, the silence outlasting whatever the original argument had been. We reconnected 8 months ago, slowly, by phone at first.
He was sick.
He had known for a while and told me in the measured way of someone who has already made his peace with an answer he did not choose. This trip was not just a funeral. I had things I needed to say to him. I had been choosing the right words for weeks. I had a letter written for my husband too, a very different kind. Let me tell you what he knew and when he knew it and what he chose to do with that information. 3 days before my flight, I made a mistake. Small and domestic, the kind that only matters in retrospect. I packed a laptop bag I hadn't used in months, a black canvas, one I kept on the shelf in the study. I was in a hurry. I didn't check the interior pocket. I should have checked the interior pocket. The letter was in there. For pages, handwritten, because some things deserve the weight of your own handwriting. It said I was leaving. It said why. It named the attorney I had been working with for 2 months and referenced the filing timeline we had agreed upon, papers to be submitted on the morning of my departure, while I was in the air and he was at work, and the timing made the logistics cleaner for both of us. He found it.
I don't know exactly when.
Sometime in the 2 days before I left, he opened that bag, looking for a charger, maybe, or a cable, something ordinary, and he found 4 pages that rearranged everything he thought he understood about his life. And then he said nothing. That is the part one keep returning to. He read that letter, and he came to dinner, and he asked me how my day was. He passed the salt. He loaded the dishwasher, which he almost never did. He kissed me goodnight in the way of someone performing a role they have only recently learned is being observed. I did not know he had found it. Not yet. I was still operating on the assumption that my plan was intact, that the papers would be filed, that I would be gone, that the conversation would happen across a distance that gave us both some room. What I understand now is that we were both performing at that dinner table for an audience of one. He could not stop the filing. My attorney had instructions that did not require my presence or my confirmation. What he could do, what he apparently decided to do at some point between finding the letter and driving me to the train station, was make sure I didn't leave. If I missed the funeral, he may have reasoned. I would come home. If I came home, we would have the conversation in person on his terms, in the house where he had more ground. It was not a rational plan. Desperation rarely produces rational plans. Here is what he did not know. 6 weeks before any of this, I had opened a separate account with a bank he had never used. I had applied for a credit card in my maiden name, reinstated legally, quietly, the previous spring. 2 hours before I left for the airport that morning, while he was in the shower, I booked a second flight on that card. Same destination, different airlines, departing 40 minutes after the one he canceled. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives not like a light switching on, but like your eyes adjusting to a room that was always lit. You don't see anything new. You see what was already there, finally in focus. The phone monitoring began in our second year. He called it a transparency exercise, something he had read about in an article on modern relationships, he said, as though sourcing the idea gave it legitimacy. We would leave our phones unlocked, screens accessible, with no private passcodes. He framed it as intimacy. I accepted it as intimacy. It took me an embarrassingly long time to notice that I checked his phone perhaps twice in 3 years, and he checked mine with the quiet regularity of someone reviewing a document he was responsible for. The visits to my father, the proposed ones, the ones that never happened, always ran into the same resistance, and it never arrived as resistance. It arrived as a budget review. As for timing, as a reasonable concern. It's just not a great month financially. You said you wanted to save for the trip we've been planning. I had stopped proposing visits so gradually that I couldn't have told you exactly when I stopped. Only at some point I had. The conference was 3 years ago. 4 days in another city, professional development, fully reimbursed by my employer. I registered, booked my flights, and arranged coverage for everything at home. 2 days before I left, he developed what he described as a possible stomach issue. By the time I landed at my destination, it had escalated, by text message, through several increasingly detailed symptoms. I cut the trip short by a day. I came home to a man who was, by then, largely recovered and slightly sheepish, and very glad to see me. The illness never recurred. Not once in the 3 years since. I am not telling you these things to construct a case. I am telling you because I spent years processing each incident individually, in isolation, the way you might examine single frames of a film without understanding they are part of a sequence. The phone was about trust. The visits were about money. The conference was a coincidence. Each explanation was plausible. Plausibility was the architecture of the whole arrangement. What I understand now is that control rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a declaration. It arrives as concern, as practicality, as love in a slightly distorted form. It works precisely because it resembles something real. And if you are a person inclined toward generosity, inclined to assume the best, to absorb the cost, to reframe difficulty as something you can manage, it will find you. It found me. I had confused monitoring with care for so long that I almost missed when it became something else. Almost. I landed at 4:20 in the afternoon. The service was at 10 the following morning. It was small and correct, and I said what I needed to say. And then I did not go home. Here is what nobody tells you about leaving a controlled life. The preparation looks nothing like escape. It looks like errands. 6 months before that morning in Terminal C, I opened a checking account at a bank neither of us had ever used. The branch was 20 minutes from my office. I went on a Tuesday lunch break, brought 2 forms of ID, and was back at my desk by 1:15. I set up an automatic transfer, modest, an amount that would not register as an absence in our joint account, the kind of sum that disappears into the general noise of monthly expenses. I did not touch what I accumulated. I let it sit. The documents came next. Not stolen, copied. Every joint financial record I could access legitimately. Tax returns, the mortgage statement, both retirement account summaries, the insurance policies. I moved them to a cloud account linked to an email address he did not know existed. This took 3 evenings. I did it after he was asleep, on my work laptop, which he had never had reason to access. The attorney I found through a referral from a colleague, whose divorce I had helped her navigate 2 years prior. We met 4 times over 3 months, always during my lunch hour, always at her office across town. She was practical and calm and charged by the hour, which focused both of us considerably. She explained the filing timeline, the asset considerations, and the procedural steps. I took notes in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer at work. The housing I arranged through a friend, a woman I had known since before the marriage, before the relocation, before I had reorganized myself around someone else's blueprint. She had a second bedroom. She had been quietly waiting for me to ask. When I finally did, she said only, "I wondered when you'd call." She did not ask for details. She gave me a key. None of this was dramatic. There were no midnight revelations, no single breaking point. It was simply the work of a person who had decided something and was methodical about following through. Each step was small. The accumulation was not. When he canceled my first flight, he disrupted a plan that no longer needed that flight to function. I sat in the arrivals hall of my hometown airport the afternoon after my father's funeral, in a plastic chair near the coffee kiosk, drinking something that was only technically coffee. My bag was at my feet. My return ticket, the second one, the one he knew nothing about, had worked exactly as intended. My attorney had confirmed the filing that morning. My friend texted to say the room was ready. I sat there for perhaps 20 minutes, doing nothing in particular. It was the first time in longer than I could accurately measure that I was not waiting for someone else to determine what happened next. No monitoring, no management, No performance of contentment for an audience of one. I finished the coffee. I picked up my bag. I rented a car and drove back toward the city, not toward the house. His assistant's name was Priya. We had met at a company holiday party 2 years prior and had one of those brief, genuine conversations that never quite grows into anything but leaves a good impression. When I called the office line 3 days before and asked if there was any availability on Thursday afternoon, a quick visit, I said, personal matter. She checked the calendar and offered me a 2:15 slot without hesitation. She did not ask for details.
I did not offer any.
I dress the way I dress for things that matter. Not formally enough to signal an occasion, but well enough to feel entirely like myself. That distinction was deliberate. I was not performing anything. I was simply arriving as the person I had always been, in a situation that now finally reflected that. The building had a marble lobby and a security desk attended by a man named Gerald, according to his badge. I signed the visitor log, accepted a paper pass, and took a seat in one of the low chairs near the elevator bank. I had a folder in my bag. I had been there 4 minutes when the elevator opened. He saw me immediately. There is a particular quality to the moment when someone realizes the architecture of their plan has failed. It moves across the face quickly, and if you are not watching for it, you might miss it entirely. I was watching it. He went pale. Not dramatically, he didn't stagger or reach for something to hold. Just a specific, unmistakable draining, the color leaving his face the way it does when the body understands something a half second before the mind catches up. I stood. I smiled. It was a calm smile, the kind that requires no effort because it comes from a place of genuine composure rather than performance. I thought it would be better to do this in person, I said. I handed him the folder. Inside were 3 things. The first was a copy of the divorce petition, filed with the county clerk on the morning of my first flight, time-stamped, signed, recorded. The second was a printed log from our shared travel rewards dashboard showing the cancellation of my ticket, the account login used, and the exact timestamp. The third was a letter on my attorney's letterhead, 2 paragraphs, outlining the next procedural steps and the contact information for all future correspondence. He looked at the folder.
He looked at me.
I did not explain. I did not elaborate. Everything that needed saying was in the folder, written by professionals in precise, unambiguous language. My attorney will be in touch with yours, I said. He said nothing. I think he was still in the half second before the mind catches up. I picked up my bag. I walked back across the marble floor toward the security desk, returned my visitor pass, and turned to Gerald on my way out. Thank you, I told him. Have a good afternoon. He smiled and said he would.
His colleagues had seen.
His assistant had seen, and someone, I would later learn, had taken a photo. I did not take the photo. I did not share it. I don't know who did, and I have made a deliberate choice not to spend energy trying to find out. What I know is that by the following evening, it had moved through our shared social circle with the quiet efficiency of information that feels significant, which, to the people who received it, it apparently was. The photo was not dramatic. That was perhaps why it traveled so well. It showed me in the lobby of his office building, composed, handing him a folder, while he stood with the particular stillness of someone who has just received news they cannot immediately process. It looked exactly like what it was. That was enough. The texts began arriving before I had finished driving back across the city. Some were from people I expected, close friends, women who knew pieces of the story, and were filling in the rest with reasonable accuracy. A few were from people who surprised me, mutual acquaintances I would not have predicted were paying close attention. One message, from a woman I had known primarily through dinner parties and occasional group vacations, said only, I always thought something was off. I'm glad you're okay. I read it 3 times. I hadn't known she'd noticed anything at all. His family called on the second day. His brother first, which I had anticipated. They were close, and the call had the careful tone of someone attempting diplomacy on behalf of a position he wasn't entirely sure he believed in. His father left a voicemail, and I did not return it. I did not feel obligated to, and I had reached the point in this process where I was done performing obligations I did not feel. His mother called on the third day. She called from her landline, the one in the kitchen of the house I had driven to 3 times a week during her recovery. She asked how I was. She asked about my father's funeral. She did not ask me to reconsider. She did not defend what he had done. She said, after a long pause, that she hoped I would be well. I told her I hoped the same for her. The call lasted 6 minutes and was one of the more dignified conversations I had during that entire period. What I watched over those first days was a particular kind of scaffolding come down. He had built, carefully and over years, a reputation as the easygoing one, generous, uncomplicated, and supportive. People believed it because he was consistent and because he understood that image is a long-term project requiring patience. I had believed it too for a long time, which is perhaps why I was the last person positioned to dismantle it. I want to be honest about what I felt watching it recalibrate. It was not satisfying. It was something more complicated, a kind of grief for the version of him I had originally chosen, and exhaustion at the distance between that version and this one. I was not sorry, but I was not celebrating either. He called on the 4th evening. I answered. He did not open with an accusation. That was the first thing that surprised me. Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy? I was sitting on the edge of the bed in my friend's spare room, still dressed, the lamp on the nightstand throwing a narrow light across the floor. I had known he would call eventually. I had prepared, in the loose way you prepare for things you cannot fully anticipate, for anger or denial or a negotiation disguised as a conversation. I had not prepared for that question, asked in that voice, which was quieter than I expected and entirely without strategy. I did tell you, I said, many times. A pause. I don't remember it that way. I know, I said. You filed it under moods. Something I was going through. A phase that would resolve itself if you waited long enough and didn't engage with it directly. Another pause, longer this time. I did not fill it. I had spent years filling silences that were not mine to fill, and I was finished with that particular habit. I didn't know it had gotten to this point, he said finally. I thought about how to answer that honestly. It didn't get to this point suddenly, I said. It arrived here the same way everything else did. Gradually and then all at once. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how was it? The funeral. The question caught me off guard in a different way, not strategically, just humanly. It was the kind of question you ask when you actually want to know. Small, I said. Correct. He would have approved of it, I think. I'm sorry about your father. A beat. I'm sorry about the flight. I'm sorry about, he stopped. Started again. I'm sorry about a lot of it. I believed him. That is the complicated part, the part that does not fit neatly into any of the versions of this story that are easier to tell. He was not performing the apology. I have known him long enough to know the difference, and this was not performance. It was a man sitting somewhere in the quiet of a house that was now half empty, understanding, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, what he had actually done. Not just the flight, but the accumulated weight of everything the flight represented. The apology was genuine. It was also too late. Not as punishment, simply as a fact. There are windows in a relationship that open and close, and the closing is rarely dramatic. It is just a moment after which the window no longer opens, no matter how sincerely you reach for it. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, he said. I looked at my phone afterward. 11 minutes. I had expected longer, somehow. 11 minutes to close something that had taken years to build and years more to quietly dismantle. I turned off the lamp. I had loved him once. That had been real. It was also over. 6 weeks later, a court date notice arrived. And then, unexpectedly, a second envelope. The court date notice came on a Tuesday in a standard envelope with the county clerk's return address. I set it on the kitchen table, my friend's kitchen table, which had become, in the 6 weeks since I arrived, simply the kitchen table, and looked at it for a moment before opening it. The date was 8 weeks out. The proceedings were progressing exactly as my attorney had described they would, methodically, without drama, one procedural step following another in the orderly way of things that have been properly prepared. He had not contested the core terms. I did not know what that cost him, and I had decided it was no longer mine to calculate. The second envelope arrived 3 days later. It was cream-colored, heavier stock, with the return address of a law firm in my father's city. I did not recognize the name. I opened it at the table with my morning coffee, and inside was a brief letter from an estate attorney explaining that my father had left an instruction for this envelope to be delivered to me directly, sealed, at the time of his estate's processing. The inheritance itself was modest, a savings account, a small sum, nothing that changed the practical shape of my life. That was not the point of it. The note was handwritten, on paper that had been folded twice. His handwriting had gotten smaller with age, more careful, the letters placed with the deliberate effort of someone who knows they are writing something that needs to last. He said he was proud of me. He said he hoped I would stop being so careful with myself. That was all. 7 sentences total, the last one a version of goodbye that managed to be both ordinary and entirely sufficient. He had written it 2 months before he died, which meant he had written it before I booked my flight, before I called to tell him I was coming, before any of the events of the last several weeks had taken their shape. He had written it simply because he wanted me to have it. I sat with it for a long time. The room I was living in faced east, and the mornings were bright in a way I had not experienced in the apartment. We had chosen west-facing for the evening light, which my husband preferred. I had not thought to have a preference. I am developing one now. I had started cooking again. Not from any conscious decision, but because my friend's kitchen was well-stocked and unhurried, and one evening I made something from memory, a dish I used to make before the relocation, before the reorganization of everything around someone else's preferences, and realized I had missed it without ever naming the missing. I was not happy yet. I want to be precise about that because easy happiness would not be honest, and this story has only worked because I have tried to be honest. But I was present, fully, quietly, accountably present in my own life. I had not understood, until recently, how long I had been absent from it. I still have the letter I wrote to my husband, the one he found in the bag. I never sent it. Let me tell you what it said. The letter was not angry. I want to say that clearly because anger would have been simpler and entirely beside the point. I wrote it over 3 evenings after he was asleep, in the same quiet hours I used for the documents and the planning and the slow work of building a door in a wall I had stopped believing contained one. It was the most honest thing I had ever written. Not because honesty requires drama, but because I had finally stopped editing myself for an audience of one. I told him I had spent years shrinking. Not because he had issued instructions. Not because he had ever looked at me and said, "Be smaller." It was subtler than that and more durable. Somewhere in the architecture of our life together, I had learned through the monitoring, the managed budget, the manufactured illnesses, and the quiet accumulation of steered decisions that taking up space made things harder. I was a person who did not like to make things harder, so I adjusted in ways that felt like compromise and functioned like disappearance. I told him I was not leaving as punishment. I want to be careful about this because it is the part most easily misread. Punishment implies the goal is his suffering, and his suffering was never the goal. The goal was a life in which I was not perpetually making myself easier to manage. I was leaving as a correction. I told him I hoped he would be genuinely well, not as the required politeness of a closing paragraph, but because I meant it. He was not a simple person, and whatever he became after this still mattered. That is the part of love that does not resolve cleanly. You do not stop caring about someone's well-being simply because you have accepted that their well-being and yours cannot occupy the same space. I told him I was going to my father's funeral and that I was not coming back to the same version of the marriage, regardless of what happened when I returned. At the bottom of the 4th page, I wrote the last line. I am not angry. I am finally paying attention. I fold the letter now along its original creases. I do not put it in the trash. I do not burn it, which would not be who I am. I put it in the top drawer of the small dresser in my east-facing room, beneath a notebook and a few other things I am keeping because they belong to the version of myself I am returning to. I stand at the window. Outside, something ordinary is happening. A neighbor walking a dog, the late afternoon light doing nothing more remarkable than arriving. It is enough. Not because I have settled for it, but because I have remembered, at last, what it actually feels like. I am not at the end of something. I am at the beginning of what I should have been building.